All right, I'm going to have you turn to Luke chapter 15, which is obviously one of the most famous stories of all of Scripture. And I'm sure you've heard messages on this, but we're going to be looking at this powerful, incredible story. And we're going to be reading verses, what was it? It was verses 11 through 32. I'm not going to read all of it just for the sake of time, but I will share, I'll read kind of portions of it, and then we'll jump into the message. Just wanted to double click on that evening that we have with the Crawford family, with Shahid and his family. If you are asking like, hey, where do I Venmo? You can Venmo me because I'm going to buy the food. And so I'll take care of that, but somebody was asking about that. And also for newcomers, if there are any of you who want to come and join newcomers lunch, just come and talk to me afterwards. We're not going to be at our house today, but we're going to go out and we'll treat you to a meal. So if you do want to join, just come and let me know after. All right, so we're going to start with verse 11, the parable of the prodigal son. And he said, there was a man who had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of property that's coming to me." And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had, took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. Oh. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants.' And he rose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him." I'm going to jump to verse 25. Now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing, and he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf, because he has received him back safe and sound. But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him, but he answered his father, "Look, these many years I've served you, and I never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, he has devoured your property with prostitutes. You killed the fattened calf for him." And he said to him, "Son, you're always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found." 2.5 years ago, on my birthday, March 27th of 2022, I was sitting on a Sunday service at Southlands, Brea. Many of you have heard the story. And they brought in a guest speaker that day. His name was Donnie Griggs, and I've had the chance to kind of get to know him since. But I didn't know him at the time. But he came in, and he preached the message at Southlands out of a passage in Jeremiah chapter 32, where the prophet Jeremiah, is instructed to buy a field or a plot of land in or around the city of Jerusalem, even though the city was about to be sieged and the people of God were about to be exiled, scattered, and sent to Babylon. And he's instructed to do this, to buy this land as a symbolic act, a faith act, believing that one day that the exiles would come back home and be planted once again in their homeland. So that's the story that you read in Jeremiah 32. And it was through that word for me that God began to speak. about planting a church or a field, you might call it, where the lost and the scattered can one day come back home to the Father's house. And that's the reason why I said yes. That's the reason why we decided to plant this church. And many of you have heard this story, but there are some of you who have come along the way. And I just wanted to share kind of the heart piece behind why we planted this church. And I know for some of you, you might feel like, hey, I'm actually a part of that scattered crowd. And I'm here, and I'm kind of getting my bearings again, and you are welcome here. That is the Father's heart to go and chase after the lost people who are scattered. And that's why we love seeing people come who have been away from the church. But I wanted to also share that, and I was compelled to share that story again because that's what Luke 15 is really all about. And I know there's a lot that we can talk about in the story, but if you go back to the previous parables, there's a common thread. It's about finding what was lost. It's about going out and searching, whether it's the coin or whether it's a sheep, or in this story, it's actually the two lost sons. But that's what you actually see here. And this is really a call for us to carry the Father's heart. And that's why I've titled this message, Carrying the Father's Heart, because what does it actually look like for us to carry the Father's heart? That's what this passage is actually talking to us about, to those who have actually left the Father's house. And so today, I just have two things that I want to share, and they're kind of like a tale of two different points. The first one is really what I was going to focus on. I'm going to share it, and I think it's really important for our community, for us here at River City. And yet, I think there's a second point that God was really highlighting for me, that He's been just putting on my heart for the last couple of weeks, and I'm going to be sharing that on the second half, which is a little bit more inward focused. So the first one is going to be more outward focused, where the second one is going to help us to look more at our hearts. And the first point that I want to share is that if we're going to carry the Father's heart, if we're going to actually emulate and to reveal the Father's heart, that we've got to be looking for and embracing the lost where they are. In this story, the younger son, you guys know the story probably pretty well. He leaves. He takes the father's inheritance, basically says to the father, I wish you were dead. I want your money. He takes it and he goes away. And he squanders all of that money on wild living, so reckless living, it says. And after he does all of that, he eventually comes to his senses. And he's like, oh my goodness, things were actually maybe better back at home, at the Father's house. So he's feeling empty. He's feeling broken. And so he says, let me go back. Maybe I can get some help. And so he starts walking back. And it says in our passage in verse 20, he arose and came to his father, but while he was a long way off, still a long way off, still hasn't encountered the Father's love, doesn't even know, right? Like, what's going to happen? The father saw him, felt compassion, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. He saw him while he was a long way off. What does that tell us about the father? It tells us that the father wasn't in his house minding his own business. He wasn't just in the house waiting for a knock at the door or hoping for a knock at the door. He's been looking for his son. He's been looking out the window. He's been looking outside the house. That's the only way that he's able to see his son while he's a long way off. He's been looking for a long time, hoping to even catch a glimpse of his son. But here's the other thing I want to talk about, which is that it says that he ran. He ran. The father ran to his son. And this is one of the most scandalous parts of the story because, as you probably have heard, old men back in those days did not run. It was a humiliating thing to do because in order for you to run, you had to lift up your tunic, okay, because they wore these robes. And in order for you to do that, right, it meant that you were going to have to expose your bare legs which is a very humiliating thing back in their society, in their culture. That this is something that they just didn't do. It was countercultural. But this father, as soon as he sees his son, goes out and runs to his son, even though it's awkward, even though it might be embarrassing, even though it's uncomfortable for him, he embraces him with love and compassion. And so if we're going to carry the Father's heart, the first thing I want to share is that we've actually got to be looking for the lost. Because if we're not looking for the lost, we're not going to see them. And we've actually got to be willing to go and meet and engage and embrace the lost where they are out there. Because the fact is, most people who have left the Father's house, they're not going to just walk back into the church. They're not just going to walk back into the Father's house. They're not going to come back to explore their faith again on their own. It's actually people who carry the Father's heart who are actually going out saying, hey, I'm going to actually go and look and search for you, and I'm going to meet you where you are. That's actually the starting point. We need to meet them where they are. And so I just want to share with you a couple suggestions and share a couple stories in a way to kind of make this practical. Because often we've heard this, but I just want to share with you a couple of ways that I think we could actually approach and meet people where they are. The first one is to engage in conversation. I wanted to make it really, really practical. Engage in conversation with people where they are. So last week, I met with Alan and Kevin, who are external elders for our church. And as we met, I don't know how the conversation got to this, but they both started talking about recent stories of how they've actually been having conversation with people outside the church. And this is actually kind of what inspired this point, because Alan was talking about how he's been going to the same barber for years and years and years. And for the first time that week, he was telling us that this guy, Alan, has suggested to him, hey, why don't you read the Gospel of Luke? And this guy had come back to him when he went to the barber and said, hey, I'm reading the Gospel of Luke with my wife for the first time ever. I'm opening my Bible. And then Kevin jumps in. He's like, hey, I got another story. And I'm like, oh no, do I have to share a story too? He's like, I went for a round of golf. And, it was just me, so I was playing with another 3 guys, in a foursome. And as we were playing a round of golf, I was just showing interest, asking questions about them, trying to get to know them. And after the round of golf was over, one of the guys pulls them aside and says, hey, can I talk to you? And so he actually said, let's go to the clubhouse. So they go to the clubhouse, and for 30, 40 minutes, they're sitting in the clubhouse, and this guy actually says to him, hey, are you a Christian? And Kevin's like, how do you know? He's like, I could tell by the way that you cared about me. In the first minute, I knew that you were a believer. And so he started sharing about his marriage and the struggles that he's going through, and they're still in touch, and Kevin's been inviting him to church. And the thing that we kind of talked about after this conversation was how most people today, more than ever before, are so self-absorbed with their own interests, with their own families, with their own thoughts. They're consumed with their own lives. We're self-absorbed. And so when people encounter others who are not self-absorbed and actually cares about them and wants to ask questions to get to know them, it's actually weird. Right? Sometimes we're like, man, why does this person keep wanting to know me? We think they're weird, right? It's countercultural. And I just want to say that this is one of the ways that God can actually reveal the Father's heart. And I'm not great at this either. I like to keep to myself. And I think for us as a congregation, we tend to be a little bit more to ourselves. And then this conversation I was having with Alan and Kevin, I was like, oh man, I don't have a story to share, like a recent story to share. And so it's something that I want to grow in. But I just want to say that if we don't grow in having conversations with people, we can't have spiritual conversations, right? Because in order for us to actually engage and to actually stir and lead and end up in spiritual conversations, more meaningful, deeper conversations, we actually have to start with engaging people in conversations. And so the first thing I just wanted to encourage you is to find ways to engage people who are on your path, who are already on your path. The second thing is this, is to show or to practice gospel hospitality. Now, I want to say that what I'm thinking about is showing gospel hospitality to people you don't know that well. Because the Greek word for hospitality in the New Testament literally means love of strangers. I don't know if you know that. Literally means love of strangers. And so often when we think of hospitality, people who are hospitable, we think about people who invite their friends over. And that's a great thing. But the truest sense of hospitality is welcoming strangers into your life. People that you don't really know well into your life, into your spaces, maybe into your living room, or maybe meeting somewhere where you can actually welcome them into your life. It's treating strangers as family. That's what it actually means to show hospitality, to bring them into meals, to bring them into cups of coffee, to bring them into your hobbies. That's what it actually means to show gospel hospitality. Last summer, we were getting ready to plant this church, and so I had more time, and yet actually we were gearing up, and so we were getting we're getting to that kind of the busy mode, and as we were right in that place, I remember Esther actually texted me saying, "Hey, there's somebody that we both know who had texted Esther and said, hey, there's a, so-and-so has a non-Christian atheist friend who has a lot of questions. And so, she wants to know if you're willing to meet with this guy." And I said, sure. And so we met at the coffee shop. We spent a couple hours at this coffee shop, and I met him. I heard out his story, and he was talking about how he left the church many years ago, and I was asking the reasons why, and afterwards he was asking about my faith story, and so I was sharing a little bit, and then he asked me hey, why are you planting this church? And so I remember telling him I'm planting this church for guys like you, and after that, I didn't hear anything. A year goes by, and out of nowhere, this past summer, he texts me and he says, hey, sorry I ghosted you for a while. Sorry you haven't heard much from me, but I want to share that I found my way back to God. And I'm like, what? How did that happen? And so we got back together, and we did coffee again, and we connected, and actually now he's at our church, Changsu. Yeah. Praise God for that. Now, I want to make it clear. God is the one who encountered him. I had nothing to do with God actually getting a hold of his life. He moved in a sovereign way, and it's so encouraging for me to see him come and to share his heart even up in the front, and just to be walking with the Lord. It is such an encouragement to me, and I didn't have anything to do with that, but I did play a small role in his journey by saying yes to meeting with a stranger. And I'm not here patting my back, but I'm here to say that God can use our simple yeses to doing what is maybe a little uncomfortable and inviting strangers into our lives. God can use that to actually move in a person's life and to be a small part in the journey. And actually, time and time again, you hear stories of people who are actually invited into people's lives, invited into homes, and that begins the starting point of a journey towards the gospel. And so we can all find ways to walk in ordinary gospel hospitality. Whether with people we encounter at work, maybe grabbing lunch with them, maybe it's with somebody you run into at a restaurant that maybe you knew from a long time ago, and it's easy for you to just be like, I'm just going to pretend that I'm not here. But man, God can use a simple hi to reconnect, to invite them into your lives again, to actually move in that person's life. And I just want to also say that event that we're doing with Shahid and his family, they're just going to be sharing. They're just 3 more examples of people who are actually living this out in their own context. And so I want to encourage you to come and hear their stories, because I want you to be encouraged. I want you to be inspired. And I want you to let that be a part of your process of saying, okay, God, how do you want me to walk this out in the places and in the context that you have called me? Because it's all different. We're all in different places. And just like what Karen was saying, it's just recognizing what God is actually doing or wanting to do in the context that you are actually in, so that you can carry the Father's heart and reveal that where you are, and to love the stranger in that kind of way. The second thing I want to share is a bit of a shift, but it's to be in the Father's presence. Yes, we've got to look out for and to engage and embrace people out there. But actually, this is the most important part of this whole story. Because you got to remember that Jesus is talking to the older brothers. He's talking to the Pharisees. This whole chapter is to the Pharisees, to the religious leaders. It's to the people who are already on the inside. And so we have to pay attention to this and look at the older brother. The parable tells us that the older brother hears the music on his way in, sees the dancing, there's feasting that's going on, and he asks one of the servants what's going on, it says. And when he finds out that his younger brother has come into the house, has come back, has returned back to the father's house, look at what it says. It says in verse 28, he was angry. He was angry and he refuses to go in. And the father comes out trying to calm him down. But he says to his father in verse 29, look, these many years I've served you, I've never disobeyed you, yet you never gave me a young goat that I can celebrate. But when this son of yours came, who devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed a fattened calf for him? Again, what we have to understand about this whole parable is that this is Jesus trying to get a hold of the Pharisees' hearts, trying to shake them. Because these were people who had spent much of their time around the Father's house, around the synagogues. And what Jesus is saying is that, hey, you Pharisees, you live in the Father's house like the older brother. You are serving the Father faithfully like the older brother. And yet, you don't know the Father's heart. You don't understand anything about the Father's heart. And what you notice in the story is that when this older brother comes in from the field, and you first notice, he's out there. He's around the Father's house, but he's not even spending time inside the house. And he doesn't go to the Father. Do you see that? He doesn't go to the Father to ask. He goes to the servant to ask. And it's so clear from this story from both what he's saying, but even the descriptions, that there's actually no relationship with the Father. There's not been getting into the Father's presence to talk to him and to listen to him and to get to know his heart. That's not there in this guy's life. And because he hasn't gotten into the Father's presence, and he doesn't know the Father's love for him as a son, he hasn't taken time to go and to be in the fire of God's love for him. Because he doesn't know that love, he is out there slaving away for love, for approval, for a reward from the Father. He's like, wait, that's my goal. That's what I've been working for. Well, because he's actually working for approval and love and affirmation. He's looking for a reward. Instead of serving out of joy, serving from the place of love, serving from the place of approval, he's not doing that. And that's the reason why he cannot celebrate when the younger son comes home and the father throws a party. Now, I think it's really easy for us to shake our heads at the older brother. You know, this is such a familiar story for us, but man, isn't it so easy for us to be like the older brother? We can be in the Father's house. We can be serving faithfully for years and years and years, and there's nothing wrong with serving. There's nothing wrong with serving within the church or serving the Father outside of the Father's house. No, there's nothing wrong with doing all the things that I just talked about. But we can be doing all of these things without His presence as our greatest priority, as our lifeline. Without enjoying a relationship with the Father and knowing His heart. And actually, when we do that, our hearts shrivel up. It starts shriveling up. It starts dying. And we either start serving for love like the older brother, for approval like this older brother, or we just say, forget it. What am I doing all this for? And we just run away from any kind of serving altogether because there's no love that's fueling us and we're just burnt out. And so we can respond in different ways. But the key is that in both cases, it is not love that is driving us and fueling us to go and rejoice, to search, and then to find and rejoice and celebrate with the younger brother and with the father. And it's so easy for us then to be looking outward as we serve, to be looking for recognition from God or from people and not out of the overflow of what God is doing in our hearts. And I share that because this is something that God has been recalibrating me in. Just a couple weeks ago, I was flipping through photos and videos from like 8-9 years ago. And I don't know, as I was doing that, my kids, they started like hearing the video sound and they all huddled like right behind me. And we were flipping through different videos and I just noticed how back 7-8 years ago, when we only had one kid, right? I used to play like guitar on my own, and there were video after video after video of Charlotte joining me in my personal worship time and like singing her heart out. And I'm like, dude, she's one. She doesn't even know what she's singing. But that's how often I was going to that place of personal worship because she knew the songs that I was singing. And so she was singing that and, all these songs. And I thought to myself, oh yeah, back before I had Alicia, when, once we had the baby, it was like, shh, everybody be quiet, okay? And like that personal worship, my personal altar, it kind of dwindled. And right when I'm like, okay, like she's old enough, let me get back into it, Aria was born, and I feel like God has been nudging me, like there's different ways to do this, But for me, God has been reminding me, like, hey, come back to the place of worship, of building your personal altar, of rekindling my heart as I come to the bonfire of God's love. And to make that a priority again. And so, I took on my guitar again very recently over the last couple of weeks. And it was really interesting because as I was pulling it out, I saw these spider webs and the dust had collected all over the case, and I took it back out. And I've been, I've just been getting back into the place of worship. And I have to tell you, like at first it's kind of like, it's awkward. Like my fingers are not calloused anymore, right? And it takes time to get back into that place, but God has been leading me to that place and to make it a priority to get back into the presence of God and to make my greatest priority ministering to the heart of God before I minister to anyone else. And as I've been worshiping, God's been softening my heart. We've had a moment of repenting to our kids. I've been repenting a lot to God. God's been softening my heart. And I've been just experiencing the Father's love burning in me again. And I just wanted to call each and every one of you to join me, to prioritize the building of your personal devotion to the Lord in worship and prayer and in the Word. You can find different ways that work for you. Set a time and a place to read or to listen to the Word, to take time to pray and to worship God. That's something that I want to call you back into, because it's a privilege to host the presence of God. It's a privilege to experience and encounter the presence of God. And I just want to say, may God give us all the grace to break free from our slumber and our distractions, because we all have them. We have the things that we turn to, but may His fire fall on us as we come back and put ourselves on the altar of worship again. And I want to remind you of Jesus, that the reason why Jesus was condemned on the cross, it was so that we will be brought in, so that God can rejoice in us and we can experience His rejoicing. And so that we can actually experience His delighting in us. And so that we can experience His love in our hearts. And I'm reminded that, again, without this love in our hearts, we're not going to really have what it takes to love people God's way. Let alone the lost and scattered. It's hard for us to love our own families, right, without the love of God that's fueling us, and we need it to fuel us to carry the Father's heart. And before I close, if I can just slip in one more thing. I also wanted to call us, yes, to build our personal altar, but also to build our corporate altar. That as you return to the place of personal worship and building that altar again, that then you would take a piece of wood, and bring that here to church, to our gatherings, and that you will put your wood on the altar so that we can actually build it together. Now, what does that look like? That could look like coming to worship ready to fully engage. This is not, I don't want this to get legalistic in any way, but I'm just calling you, let's build a place where God's presence, His manifest presence, can be encountered and experienced, and the fire that we bring can rub off on other people. And if we come empty, that we're actually encouraged as we come in together. And so that's one of the ways, is to actually come fully engaged and lean in with expectation that as we come together, that we're going to meet God, right? That we're going to experience the presence of God here. Another way that I want to be soft on, but I do want to throw out, is that you actually come on time to place your wood on the altar, because you might have the wood, but man, if we're coming to a bonfire and you're the one bringing the wood, and you come after everyone has left, or after that time is done, you've missed it, right? And so this is not legalistic. This is to say, hey, let's come together so that we can actually build together. And one of the practical ways is to actually come on time. Now, I know sometimes we have the roughest mornings and it just doesn't happen. There's grace for it, but I just wanted to ask you to make your effort to come on time. I know that when I talk about this, I'm actually pushing up against like just Southern California church culture. There's a very strong culture of just like casual, like walking into worship. And we want it to be for everybody. So in that sense, we want it to be informal. But at the same time, we want to come saying, hey, we are coming in to worship God. We are coming here to meet God. And so if there's somebody that you're meeting with that's important to you, you're going to be there, and you're going to be there on time, or you're at least going to try. And that's something that I wanted to ask you. And again, I'm not trying to guilt trip you. And if you are late, it's okay. Nobody's going to give you the stink eye, okay? But that's something that I wanted to challenge you with. And another thing, one more thing, it might look like joining the team that leads us into worship. Brian, John, and Sam, we've had a 3-man show when it comes to worship. Haven't they done an excellent job for a year, almost a year now? Can we give it up for them? They've been leading us faithfully, but I think now is time for us to start growing the team that leads us into worship. And so if you have a praise background, or you sing, or you want to sing, or you play an instrument, I'm not going to say names here. Was that? Oh, Karen has also led us up here. Okay. Yeah, let's give it up for Karen as well. Okay. But I just wanted to encourage you to help us build our corporate altar of worship as well. So with that in mind, I'm going to close just by sharing a quote by one of my favorite guys, John Piper. I read this book, Let the Nations Be Glad, back in college. And he talks about the relationship between worship and missions. And it's like on the front page, the first page. This is what he says. Missions. And when we say missions, I don't want you to think like overseas missions. Missions can be here. Missions is going out of the Father's house and engaging in the work and the mission of God wherever we are, right? Missions is not the ultimate goal of the church. Worship is. Missions exist because worship doesn't. Worship is ultimate, not missions, because God is ultimate, not man. When this age is over and the countless millions of the redeemed fall on their faces before the throne of God, missions will be no more. It's a temporary necessity, but worship abides forever. Worship, therefore, is the fuel and goal of missions. It's the goal of missions because in missions we simply aim to bring the nations into the white-hot enjoyment of God's glory. The goal of missions is the gladness of the peoples and the greatness of God. The Lord reigns. Let the earth rejoice. Let the many coastlands be glad. Let the peoples praise thee, O God. Let all the peoples praise thee. Let the nations be glad and sing for joy. But worship is also the fuel of missions. Passion for God in worship precedes the offer of God in preaching. You can't commend what you don't cherish. You can't commend what you don't cherish. Missionaries will never call out, "Let the nations be glad," who cannot say from the heart, "I rejoice in the Lord. I will be glad and exult in thee. I will sing praise to thy name, O Most High." Missions begins and ends in worship. And so I wanted to call all of us. I'm going to have Brian and Sam come up. I wanted to remind you, and I wanted to call all of us back into the presence of God. And I'm not saying that we haven't. This is not me saying it's been black and white like for the last year we have. No, that's not what I'm trying to say. I'm saying, hey, let's be more intentional and let's make this the priority of our lives and of our church, to center our lives around the presence of God that Jesus has paid such a dear cost for, so that we may be able to enjoy and experience as a church.